Hello, good evening, and welcome to everyone tonight. My name's Avril Hepner, and I'm from the BDA in Scotland. Tonight, I'm so excited that our edition of BSL Blethers, our guest, will be speaking about this topic called. You can see at the bottom of the screen what we're talking about. Now, what actually is ghostwriting about? We're not talking about ghosts, we're talking about the action of ghostwriting, which is other deaf people helping each other. Now, the reason we've decided to look at this just now is that we've noticed in Scotland that this has been happening not just here, but all over the world. So tonight, we thought it would be a good opportunity to share maybe your own experiences or comments with our guest tonight, and hopefully he can reply with you. So I'm really excited to welcome Robert Adam. Hello, Robert.
Hello. It's really nice to see you. Hello.
Robert, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me on to
You're
BSL
welcome.
Blethers with you tonight. Um, I've heard so much about it. I've seen so many great things.
Ooh,
BSL Blethers is well
thank you.
respected in the community, so I'm honoured to be invited. So I work at Heriot-Watt University. I'm a lecturer here. I've been here for, well, over 2 years now.
Time flies.
Yeah, I used to work in London at DCAL at the University
Okay.
of Central London, UCL, and then I've moved to work in Scotland
Oh,
now.
well, welcome to Scotland,
Thank
Robert.
you.
Yeah, I mean, you moved sort of during the coronavirus, so I'm glad that maybe things are getting back to normal. And I know that you were on the board of the BDA. So
Yes,
how
the
long have
committee.
you been on the board now?
I've just started. So I'm just in my second term. I started in June. So, well, coming up to a year, I suppose.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for your time for coming here tonight. So tonight's topic is about ghostwriting, and I've actually saw some of your work where you've actually mentioned ghostwriting. It was an article that you wrote. Here it is. I've actually got a copy of it, and I was having a wee skim through it, and I thought, I need to ask you onto our show because I think maybe first people maybe think ghostwriting is related to ghosts or something spiritual, but it's not, is it, Robert? Can you explain what it really means?
Well, the article was co-authored. Three of us pooled our research. So it was me, Christopher Stone, and Brita Carty from Australia, who is an expert in deaf history. So we talked and we did together. We recognized this as a topic, did a number of interviews and produced that article. Now, since the article's been published, so many people have talked about it, approached me about this topic, and it seems that there have been lectures all over the world and people coming forward and saying this is something that happens in their communities.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because when I read the article, it completely resonated with me and my experiences, my parents' experiences. And I just thought we've not really had this discussion in Scotland. So that's why I thought it'd be great tonight. So, could you tell us about when you did the article? Was it recent or how did the research go? How long did it take?
Well, just a little over 10 years ago, I started thinking
Wow.
about this topic and thinking, actually, deaf people do translation. They do translation in order to support each other. Yeah. So I interviewed a number of deaf people at that time. And, I just thought I'd just interview 4 people in Australia, 4 people in Britain, and do a little comparative study just to see what the similarities and differences were. And I have to say, it was really mostly about similarities. So Australia and the UK obviously have similar systems. Deaf clubs and agencies and committees and things, they're all kind of very similar. They're established very similarly. So deaf people within those systems were supporting each other in similar ways.
Okay. Could I ask you again, Robert? So, just for our audience members, could you have an example of ghostwriting?
Well, I remember when I was young and I used to go to the deaf club and I used to see deaf people chatting to each other. And, as a kid, you used to kind of, take a peek at other people's conversations, just snack in on those. Um, and people would say, oh, I don't know about this text here. And they'd say, take it to the ghostwriter. And that's where I got the term from. It stuck in my mind. So that would mean that they'd be asking another deaf person to help them with the text. And that might be books, sports, other kind of famous people that you see around in the wider hearing world who are kind of celebrities, sports celebrities or famous people, often don't have time to write their own books, so they have ghost writers. And I think it's a similar sort of system that we have in deaf clubs, but it's nothing to do with ghoulies and spectres and that kind of thing at all.
Oh, that's a relief. Well, we can put that to one side.
Maybe that's the topic of another blether.
You
Go
never
forward.
know. Never know. So anyway, you were saying about ghostwriting. Really, in fact, what it was a deaf person identifying another deaf person who they believed to be good at English, and they basically took over and did the translation for that deaf person.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it made me think that maybe I've been through that. So I wanted to explore this a wee bit more. So why did that happen? Where did it stem from? Or who were these ghostwriters?
Well, really, I think to explain that, we need to kind of roll the clock right back. So remember, I was interviewing these 4 people in Australia and 4 people in the UK. Now, these were older deaf people, not younger deaf people, mixture of men and women, but all older. Unfortunately, they were all white. And so that was a problematic. If I had my time over again, I'd make sure that the informants were much more diverse. But maybe I can do a phase 2, where
Yeah.
I interview more diverse people about the same, that experience, and find out whether it was similar or different for them. But anyway, the original interviewees, back to them, I talked to them about their experiences. And really, what we were finding with those interviews was that within the deaf community, there was a kind of
Mhm.
sharing of skills. Now, we're back in the day here, back in the old community, they would share skills. So if somebody was good at, a really good car mechanic, or another deaf person was a really good joiner, or another deaf person was a really good seamstress, another deaf person was a good cobbler, or your father, I believe, Avril, was an optician. That's a
That's
skill.
correct.
So, all of these deaf people would bring all of their skills to the club. And if somebody wanted some support in any one of those areas, they would approach them. And that's what the deaf club was for.
My mother had a white Vauxhall Beetle.
And when the clutch went, she would take it to the deaf club, and the person who was good at, mechanics would, kind of mend it, or they'd come over to my parents' garage and they'd look for all the right bits for the car, and, they'd work together to fix it, and the car would be repaired. And my father would go out and support other deaf people, if they were putting shelves up in their kitchen or whatever, because he was a good joiner. So the system kind of worked like that. It was this skills exchange. Now, in the article, when we interviewed these deaf people, we found that the joiners, the seamstresses, the opticians, the mechanics were also joined by people who were good at translation effectively. So in the deaf club, they would identify those members of the club who were really good at English,
Mhm.
and they would be asked to translate things. They would be asked to write things, so writing down from sign language into English, and that was their skill.
Oh, Robert, you're so right. You've just made me have a sort of flashback. And I think when I go back to at the deaf club, well, I think the reason it's important for me is in the deaf club in the past we had so many, but as you know, there's a lot of deaf clubs have closed. So is ghostwriting still taking place? And when you look at the time, deaf people were really were trading in manual skills, but they were trading in translation as well. But I never really thought of it like that. When I think back, you're right. You mentioned my father was an optician. Well, he worked in an optician fixing glasses, and he would ask someone to maybe write a letter for him, and he would say thank you. And, and the way he would appreciate or show his appreciation would be fixing the glasses. And honestly, our doorbell was flashing all the time when my dad would be fixing glasses. So it was this exchange of skills that really connected the community, and it's such a strong network, and it was amazing. Did Australia have that or similar?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember when I was younger, I left school. I never played cricket. I was no good.
Oh,
I know
cricket. Okay.
Australia, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I was never good at it. But the Deaf Cricket Club invited me to kind of do their administration for them. And I'd get a pint bought for me in the deaf club, So it was just that exchange of value, exchange of worth, really. And it also meant that you met lots of other people, you exchanged skills, they'd invite you into their home or their association, or, if there was something going on in the deaf cricket club or whatever, I'd volunteer to help them with that. And you just get invited to so many different things if you volunteer to, provide your skills in exchange.
You're absolutely right, because it is a way of meeting new friends.
Getting
Yeah,
new experiences,
yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely, and also traveling as well, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking, your life, when you think of it, ghostwriting.
Oh, definitely. The Deaf Club offered me so many experiences, so many skills, so many kind of, being in committee meetings, I would note take, and there were particular procedural ways of writing the notes. It had to be this and this and this and this, and, mistakes were always corrected, it had to be absolutely correct. The running order of the meeting, the way the meeting was conducted, the agenda, who had their responsibilities. They were very clear cut. Everybody had
Absolutely.
their role, everybody had their place, and I learnt those kind of skills from the Deaf Club. From being the secretary, those kind of secretarial and admin skills have served me well for 35 years, I have to say.
And you would say ghostwriting is part of that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because it makes me think, and I look back as well, particularly within in the deaf club, it would be the committee members or the people that would do for the
Yeah,
football,
I
or
get you.
whoever it was, or whatever group it was, or the
Good
Deaf
tools,
Olympics.
tips. Yep, yep.
Yeah, that's right. Or it was international football. I can remember, I'm not really a particularly sports person, but my skill was English. So
Right.
because I was able to provide that, I ended up being able to go with them.
Absolutely.
And we look at the deaf clubs now, and we don't have the same, and it's happening all around the world as well. So, do you think ghostwriting's still taking place in that forum?
Well, I think, yes, good to go back. Being a ghostwriter was part of those kind of skills that you could exchange. You would do passports for people, sort out their tickets, their plane tickets, their train tickets, whatever. So you
Mhm.
had to be comfortable with writing. But
But when I'm going back to when I was wee, I can remember we had a deaf neighbour in our street, and my father's English it wasn't that great. He was a strong BSL person, and honestly, the two of them had nothing in common other than this exchange, where um, this person could do translation, and honestly, he had a briefcase. He worked in a printers. He was always really smart, and where he got his language and English skills, I have no idea. But he would come to my father's house, open up his briefcase, his pen and paper, take his notes. Really, so professional, a very proud man, and he became very popular. He became identifiable as the person who was really, really good at English and getting the results, and he was always busy.
that's right.
Um, so he was in effect a ghostwriter. They realised that in the past they would maybe go to hearing people, but going to a deaf person was just so much easier.
Yeah, the briefcase. I mean, it would be a laptop now, wouldn't
Of
it?
course.
2022, just plug it in, wouldn't you? But yeah, no, you're right. Um, you know, these weren't people who really had very high level jobs, as we would consider that now. I mean, they used to be, civil service clerks, admin officers or coordinators. They used to be called clerks in the old days. So they weren't kind of high up in the civil service. But they were better off than people who were cobblers or joiners who had perhaps, less English skill.
So in the past, would ghostwriters didn't really get paid. They would go into the deaf club, there would be a queue, they'd maybe spend the whole evening dealing with everybody else. But what was their return? What was their benefit, or what did you think?
I think it was just a part of the value. Friday night I used to go to the deaf club and I'd say, can I get a lift? And I'd get a lift home. I mean, I wouldn't do it now. I'd be looking at Google Maps on my phone. It's very different. The world is very different now. But I think, the community has changed as a result of that. I think there are, as you say, fewer deaf clubs, but also deaf people have different jobs. We're not doing those, joinering and mechanicking that we used to do before, those manual skills. I think we learn English in school a little bit more, so we're a little bit more confident with English. There are more professional deaf people now who work as social workers, who work as translators, deaf people who are qualified translators as a profession, so you would email your thing to them, or you would approach a social worker. Those people didn't exist before, but they do now. Social work is clearly much more organized. And also remember, way back in the day, the missioners did everything. They did the kind of finances, the discipline, the wedding of people, the admonishing of people, driving, all of that kind of stuff. And deaf people are much more independent now. We do things on our own now. We do things independently. You're much more likely to meet a deaf professional who's a social worker or who's a translator who will offer to do that kind of ghostwriting task for you, which we now call translation, but it's very different.
Yeah, I think when I look back and I look at the deaf clubs, there tends to be a kind of, well, an identifiable group, if you like, that are known as the ones who would give support. And then as times have sort of changed, the shift has maybe went to sort of deaf organisations, because maybe in the past the social workers or professionals were there given translation there, so they could go there, it was ease of access.
Yeah.
Also, you know, they would have a translation service perhaps
Mm-hmm.
within a deaf club, so you didn't really need the same support. So I'm wondering, was ghostwriting, did it become redundant as a result of that? What do you think?
Yeah. It's difficult to say. I'm sure, we all miss that kind of contact from the deaf club, that kind of sense of knowing the same people are going to be there every time. But that's declined now. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that deaf people are more professional. You have, SLIs, deaf SLIs working in remote video services. So, we have that. I don't know, is that a benefit? I'm not sure. It's just a change.
Oh, it's interesting. I'm just thinking of the comparison that, at work, okay, I can understand you're at work and get paid for it, but when you were in a deaf club, you could be there at this corner for hours and hours on end, just dealing with anybody's issues. And they were busy, absolutely chock-a-block, and you could see in their face and everybody around them that this was important work and people respected that. Half the time you would need to almost book an appointment. And it's interesting, it's the in BDA Scotland, we've got a new BSL helpline. And honestly, I feel in some ways this is becoming almost like ghostwriting as well.
True. I mean, you talked about in the deaf club. I mean, I remember the same thing, that you would go up to, the same person would be approached and you'd sign, or somebody who could hear well, not a hearing person, but somebody who could hear well would interpret, would stand up. If there was a speaker, they'd be at the front, translating that into sign language. And that person would probably be the person who was trusted with writing that down. And, yeah, it all goes around and comes around, doesn't it? But thinking about when I grew up, It started in school, really, because you'd send letters home to parents, wouldn't you, saying, "I need some new shoes," or, whatever it was, and you
Oh,
get someone
yeah.
to write that template, and we'd all copy it and send off for new shoes or sweets or magazines or cake or whatever it was we felt we needed. Um, and many teachers didn't sign well, so we were left to our own devices, and it was really, about, passing messages to each other. Really deaf people used um, kind of different forms of language term, language brokering, it's called. That's the official term. Different ways of language brokering. It's not interpreting per se. It's not a paid professional thing where you pass one message to the other. Absolutely. But it's called language brokering, the kind of thing that a child does with parents who might arrive in the UK who don't speak English. When the child does, they might help
Like
them
being
out
a
in the
bridge.
shop. Yeah, that kind of thing. So really, deaf people in schools used to do that with each other. Deaf pupils used to do that with each other. We used to language broker with each other. And if you think about the history of interpreting, if you go back far enough to when sign language interpreting was established, before all of those kind of things, it was deaf people getting in touch with people whose parents were hearing or whose parents were deaf, would
Got
do the
it.
signing, parents were hearing, would do the English. So we had our own
Yeah.
ways,
It
our own
was a
underground
community.
network, as it were, of doing all that. It was very unseen, but it was there.
Well, when I looked at your article, Robert, I noticed that there was, the theme of capital,
Mm.
and I'm wondering ghostwriting and having sort of social capital. What do you mean by that?
Capital. Well, that's exactly the right sign. Capital, which is this kind of thing that you have, so by being in the deaf community, by being deaf, by being able to sign, by knowing other members of the deaf community, by being experienced in deaf culture, you
Okay.
accumulate this kind of capital, I suppose, ticks on a list, if you want to think of it that way. And so those people who would organize events, who'd be elected onto committees, who would chair or be secretary or whatever, who would rise up through the ranks of the deaf community, who would gain status in the deaf community, would accumulate this kind of social
Ah,
capital. They'd be
so that was
known,
it.
and so they would know the hearing well, perhaps the language brokers, and they would know the deaf world, and they would accumulate that capital, and they'd be respected for it.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because the first thing that you want is trust and privacy, and that would cause you anxiety. So you must have trust with your ghostwriter, and I
Absolutely.
think that's key.
And also, going back, before deaf people were involved in professions, social work was a really highly paid job. Running the deaf club was a really kind of top job. You had a lot of
Yep, got it.
capital. Times have changed now, and it's much more equitable in the deaf club. But
Well, I still have a list of questions for you, but I think we've got a question coming in from one of our audience members. I think it's Linda Richards.
okay, hi Linda, hello.
Okay, so the question's up on our screen just now, and it says deaf people often didn't have high positions at work because they were channeled into specific occupations by their schools. In the majority of cases, despite being skilled at their jobs, many were in fact unemployed, sold out by their deaf schools. What do you think,
Yeah,
Robert?
I think back in the day, yes, you're right. People were given manual labor, seamstresses and whatever. They weren't promoted into or pushed into or encouraged into white collar jobs at all. Even if they were good at school and they're academically successful, they would still be channeled into those manual
I
trades.
hope
Linda's
you like.
absolutely right.
Sorry, I hope you liked that answer, Linda.
But they still may have had English skills that they traded in the deaf community. So they might not have been
Ah,
paid well in the hearing world, but they'd have this capital in the deaf community.
do you imagine if you get paid a penny for every time you ghostwriting in the past? You'd be so rich. But how did they kind of? I mean, was there a recognition for that work, that skill? Or was it sort of like a thing that happened later on in life? Or how did it sort of manifest itself?
I think it was just usual. I mean, it was the normal thing. It was the norm. Often people who are skilled at running or carpentering or whatever, they often have a really great home. A fisherman will have um, their own skills, and so people were kind of just known for particular skills. And you
Ah,
remember that there used to be a lot of finger spelling, and that's interesting actually, because when young people look at older real deaf people who spell everything, those people were quite literate. They could transfer those finger spelling skills onto paper. They wrote well. And at Decal, when I worked in London previously, we used to do brain scans and look at people who were sign language
wow.
users, and look at how their brains worked and which functions were activated by signing. And it was really interesting, when you're receiving sign language, two parts of the brain are activated, and they're the same parts of the brain that are activated when you receive speech. Now, when you're reading English words, a visual kind of reading, a particular part of the brain is activated. It's at the left-hand side at the bottom of the brain.
Okay.
What we found with deaf people when we put them through the scanner was that finger spellers activated exactly that same part of the brain. So reading finger spelling and reading words are very closely related. So we always thought that, but we now have
Wow.
actual evidence to support that. So the brain is activated in the same way, whether you're reading English or reading finger spelling. Yeah.
Wow. The
Oh, the
finger
value of
spelling
learning
work.
finger spelling in school. It's really important, right? I don't know whether people are taught that anymore these days.
You're absolutely right, because I can remember actually just thinking of older people that would take the minutes of the meetings, and you would see their wee fingers going, and the minutes were absolutely perfect in English.
And also remember the Deaf Club AGMs, they used to look down at the papers, didn't they, and finger spell everything out. Do you remember
Oh,
that in the
yeah.
old
Oh,
days?
yes. I do remember. We've got another question in from Helen.
Hi, Helen.
Okay, so the question is, what is the difference between ghostwriting and language mediation? And what I'm meaning is in the context of BSL or sign language users. I'm not talking about spoken language.
I use that term ghostwriting only because I once saw somebody use it in the Deaf Club. So I just borrowed that term. I thought it was a really nice word to use. Um, in terms of language mediation, really that's a formal term. Um,
Okay.
yeah, it's when you work between two different languages. It's a person who can explain something in one language, to the other language. Um, so it's about having formal skills in both languages to mediate in specific situations. Ghostwriting is just a kind of thing that normal deaf people did in the Deaf Club, and it wasn't
Okay.
necessarily, formalized. It was about signing and writing, and so I use that term because it was always a very informal circumstance, and it was seen informally, and yet the Deaf Club still had its own kind of underground system, really, its own clandestine system. It wasn't formally named, you weren't formally given that position, it just existed, whereas language mediation has guidelines, has formal kind of qualifications and so on. So I used the term ghostwriting to cover the informality of what was occurring in the sign language community.
Oh, that was a lovely explanation. I know we've got other questions coming in, but I just want to refer back to your article again. When you spoke about ghostwriting, um, what was what was sort of how did they sort of give that back to the deaf community or receive something back from the deaf community? How did it start?
I think when deaf people went to school, they they didn't go to the Deaf Club and go, "Hey, this is what I've got to offer." It was just part of life's journey. You kind of, if you enjoyed doing something and you needed a bit of
Okay.
support, someone would just enjoy doing that for you. Do you know what I mean? It kind of happened naturally. Um, And as people learned through life, they would kind of give more to members of the community and receive more. It was just a sort of natural exchange that occurred, I think. I don't know, other people might have more of a kind of formal understanding of that, but from the way I learned it, it was this kind of really informal system of sharing.
Yeah, I do remember that. There was one part in the article that really did make me chuckle, and I don't know if it's still the case now, but there would always be certain groups of people that would go to the deaf club, but they would also go to the hearing club or the pub or a nightclub and mix with hearing people. And the assumption was that because they did that, they were really good at English and we relied on them. So we would also say to them, "Go and do that for us. Will you write that for us or say?" So I wonder, I'm thinking there is ghostwriting there.
It's not really ghostwriting, but it tended to be the same people, right, who would do these kind of things. It might be people who could speak a bit, who could hear
That's
a
right.
bit, and they'd be recruited to, go and order the food in the restaurant, or that kind of thing. So yeah, and as you say, dinner dances, that kind of thing. It would be, hi, will you tell this person that I want to dance with them, or whatever. I mean, those social nights used to be so important at deaf clubs. So, I still, even today, people go to those kind of dinner dance nights, right? Very
I
important.
can remember my mum and dad going to the Plaza Ballroom in Glasgow, and they had a pal who was really good at speaking, the other one good at writing, and they made sure that they got to the managers to make sure that they could get in. I mean, honest to goodness, but that's what they did. They
You'd
loved
just
it.
text now, wouldn't you? Deaf people just be texting. So there'd be an app, and
True.
the big app. You just kind of write it down and show, like, "Hello, I'm deaf. Can we come into the dance?" No, and then the bouncer would say no or whatever, and that's your conversation finished. But you didn't have that back in the day.
Yeah. Well, we've got a comment in now from Linda Richards. So Linda's comment is ghostwriting still exists where there are deaf clubs, no ghostwriting, but it switches to a different channel. For example, via text, FaceTime or Zoom. That is alive and well. Yeah, Linda, I think you're absolutely right. Oh, sorry, I'm just repeating what Linda's saying that you're right. We have changed to more modern technology.
Yeah, and also I think people film themselves, don't they? And they record themselves on their phone and then send it to the ghostwriter and get them to do
You
it.
know, that's right, because that sort of happened to me. I've actually myself, I've not been sure of something, and I've put something down and then sent it to someone. So I suppose they're acting in a way. I've been,
Or proofreading, really, I suppose.
ah,
Deaf people often get
of
asked that.
course. Yeah, so ghostwriting hasn't really, it's not died away or disappeared or redundant. It's a natural form in social construct that just changes, with technology. And now I suppose we're using cameras to sign things or using our text messages. Ah,
Yeah, yeah,
fantastic. Thanks,
absolutely.
Robert. Well, I suppose it sort of makes us think, that uh in a more positive way, that it's not that the deaf clubs have shutting down and we've lost something. We still have it, it's just changed.
But also that deaf technology, supports the closing of deaf clubs in a way, but in another way, it helps us to communicate and makes access more easy.
Oh,
Swings and
yes.
roundabouts.
It really is, it's a balance. Could you said that you were a secretary in the cricket club and everything else. Is there anything else? I'm just curious for being in Australia and looking at your own personal experience that you notice coming to Scotland or anywhere else that's different.
Uh, One thing I think I've given workshops and talks about deaf translators and interpreters all over the world, and it's amazing. Absolutely everywhere, people say, "Oh, it's the same here." They might call it different things, or it might kind of take slightly different shades, but really the experience is similar all over the world. I mean, Europe, Indonesia, everywhere, Asia, all over the world. Um, it's the same experience. And I think, it varies depending on the residential school, those who have residential schools and deaf clubs, um, you know, there's a very strong tradition of ghostwriting
Ah,
where you find those kinds of things in place. Um, Also, I think, there are people who start ghostwriting very young, like 10, 11, and I remember that was my experience. And I grew up thinking, why do we always have to ask hearing people? What's this thing about asking hearing people to do things for us? Because we have deaf people in the community, we can do that. And certainly now we have deaf professionals, deaf interpreters, deaf translators. And obviously, we can have subtitles and all kinds of things, station announcements, on screen images, but why do we always have to rely on hearing people as interpreters? You know, as you say, I used to be in the cricket club, netball club as well. I used to organize national tours, World Deaf Games, Deaf Olympics, we would go to that. We went to Romania, New Zealand, I don't think we went to, but we went to Bulgaria. And we went to Copenhagen, Denmark. So those 3 Deaf Olympics, I
wow.
planned those international men's and women's teams and did all the writing for that. And, so I was heavily involved. So it involves a lot of travel, going to a lot of competitions, meeting lots of deaf people,
Marvelous.
socializing. I still have friends
Wow.
from those kinds of activities. I've never actually played a game of netball. I'm sure I've broken my nose or given myself a black eye or something. I've never played cricket, you know, but nonetheless, I'm part of those communities. I'm part of those associations, and it's really
So
important.
useful. It's funny, you're making me think about things when I was younger. I always think about the chap with the briefcase, but I can remember my dad would help without thinking. It didn't have to think about it. It just was like, yep, come here for dinner. Or if you did something for me, my mum would get extra food in, the better foods, make sure he's everything's all settled for him, you know. And it was just to make sure that that was an exchange, a return, a gratitude. There was no money involved. I
No,
never ever seen any cash involved.
no money, but um, there are cultural experiences and opportunities to meet more people, learn more signs, like
Mhm.
cricket signs or whatever. Like I say, those are not things I would use in everyday life. Never played a game, but those words, those people, those connections. I remember going to West London Deaf Cricket Club, when I came back from Australia many years ago when I moved over, and meeting all those people in real life, and I knew them. I already knew them from
Of
those
course.
connections, right? So when I got here, I already knew people in London because of those connections. And like I said, I never
Yeah,
played cricket. It's marvelous,
connection.
isn't it?
So that's so interesting because you obviously came here from Australia to live or
Right.
live in the UK, and you were a ghostwriter, in Australia. Did you find your ghostwriting reduced?
Yeah, I still have some friends who will ask me
Ah,
to ghostwrite for them or text me saying, please, can you just clarify this English, or please, can you do this? So,
all
yeah,
the way from down
yeah,
under?
yeah. Because, you become known, don't you? So it doesn't really matter. And I'm happy to do it, I have to say.
Wow. I can remember, when I'd visit my parents, there was a pile of brown and white envelopes.
OHMS, yeah.
Honestly, there was a stack of them on the table, and they would say to me, "Are you ready?" And um, or either I would write the thing for them, or more times I would write on a piece of paper, and then
Uh-huh.
they would copy word for word what I was saying,
Yeah.
stick it in the envelope, and they would do that until every single letter was done, all handwritten. Nowadays we can do it in seconds with a computer.
Yeah. Just take a picture, attach it to your email.
Absolutely, but before, just how long it took.
I used to write sick notes, for school, so and so is ill and can't come, and they'd be copied and passed on. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, amazing, all of those experiences. Could I ask you that, in your article, it was interesting, and you mentioned, about children's stories. Can you explain a wee bit more about ghostwriting in relation to children?
Well, people in deaf schools used to tell the most amazing stories in residential schools about, what happened when they watched the television the night before. They'd retell that story, or they'd go home at the weekend if they weren't boarders. They'd go home to maybe a deaf family, um, and or the hearing family, and they'd be told, stories, and they'd come back to school and they'd retell those stories in sign language, and these are stories that hearing people have said this, hearing people have told me this, or whatever. So in the deaf club we used to have videos that were subtitled. We didn't used to watch TV. We would hire videos from the subtitles, like The Wizard of Oz. The film The Wizard of Oz? I used to watch that, no subtitles. The first time I saw it with subtitles, I was like, oh, is that it? Amazing stories to go with those images. And the actual story was really disappointing when I got access to the subtitles. So, that's what deaf people in residential schools, those people who came from deaf families, those people who could sign, they would kind of exchange these amazing stories. Yeah, they sit around at night, all watch someone tell a story. Everyone would take it in turns. There were people who were really well known as good storytellers in
So,
school.
would that be ghostwriting?
Well, it's part of that kind of language brokering again, isn't it?
We've got another question in from Linda. And there's Linda's question at the bottom of our screen. So Linda's asking, you mentioned your study did not have
Good
any people of
question.
colour. Do you think their ghostwriting would be different? And if so, why?
I think it might be. I think it might be different. But I'd because maybe they would rather ask for help within their community than ask deaf people who are not people of color, rather than ask a white deaf person. So because again, they're a minority within our majority deaf community, aren't they? So I don't know whether there'd be any difference, but I think it would be really interesting to ask them, because I think their experiences of oppression and neglect and marginalization are very different. So I'm sure that the stories will be
I
different.
can see a part 2 coming for this study. I
Yeah.
definitely can.
Also, I'd like to ask young people under 20 what their experiences are as well. So, what would you do if you're given a text? Do you approach a deaf person, or, what do you do with that text if you want help with it? Or do you deal with it yourself? I'm really interested to find out about that.
You're absolutely right, because, unfortunately, we still live in a society where a good education is not guaranteed. So
Yeah.
there might be some deaf people who don't have that
Yeah. Do
access.
you know who to ask, or do you not know who
Yeah.
to ask? Absolutely. Yeah. And if you're connected to the community, I assume that you will know who to ask. But, if you're an isolated young deaf person, do you ask hearing people, or do you not ask anyone at all? What happens?
Oh, yeah. We've got another question coming in. It's from Erin McCluskey. Erin's question is, what is your favourite memory of being involved with ghostwriting?
Mm,
Oh, it's a big question.
mm. I think I'm going to come back to the cricket, because that's what I always remember, because it's such a different world. I had no interest in cricket at all. I've never even watched a game. I've never watched a test match or anything like that. But it was just great to be part of that world. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Went to their events, their presentation nights, their speeches, I was involved in the planning committee, chatting to everybody about the cricket. And, so I think that would probably be my favorite memory.
Oh, thank you, Robert. I think I've got someone that's wanting to clarify something. It's Linda.
Or would their
Oh,
writing be different? Who knows, Linda? Who knows? I guess it depends on their individual language background. Whether they went to school in that country or somewhere else. There's so much variability. Gender would affect that as well. So yeah,
yeah,
don't
it
know.
could be the writing style or the language, or it could be culturally driven. Good question.
Yeah, you need to do the interviews. Yeah.
We've got another question from Helen Folks.
Great.
So the question is, thinking about the professionalism of deaf translators and interpreters in recent years, do you think this has affected expectations of deaf exchange? And the reason I'm thinking about that is of the demise of the deaf clubs and how this has affected BSL access to information. What do you think?
I think one of the massive things has been COVID. You know, what did deaf people do through COVID, through the pandemic? How did they get information? A lot of people, you know, in the UK, the government put a lot of information on written information on their web pages, and we're all familiar with the hashtag campaign, where is the interpreter? So deaf people needed information in BSL and they couldn't find it. So they often turned to other deaf people to say, what does this mean? What's this term mean? What's that? What's a bubble?
Yeah.
What does this mean? You know, and things were changing so quickly. All these new terms were coming up one after another after another. So
Yeah, I can
yeah.
remember.
So, you know, they were asking other deaf people to help them out, to help them understand that. So they were asking other deaf people, but were the deaf people giving them the right or the wrong answers? I mean, you know, many deaf people didn't understand some of that terminology. You know, I myself was kind of, you know, unsure about some of those things. I would ask work colleagues, you know, what are these rules? Are we allowed to do this or what? You know, I was asking because the rules changed so frequently as well, didn't they? And the rules were different between England and Scotland. And so you'd read all of these sources of information. It was difficult to disentangle what was what. So when there's an emergency like that in the world, there's a crisis, I think we still do turn to other deaf people, and we watch deaf people translate the news on television or on web channels. So I think it would be interesting to do that research, but I think deaf people did still turn to other deaf people.
You might know that the BDA have been campaigning with the Scottish Parliament and BBC News to make sure that we had interpreters live for First Minister questions. But also during COVID, we made sure we had interpreters up for coronavirus. But what we used to do was, because the interpreters were all there live, they were following the order, the English order of what the minister was saying, or the First Minister was saying. So what we did at the BDA, we did a cultural translation.
Yeah, I think that is a summary translation. I think that's a summary translation. I think ghostwriting is more informal. I think it takes place in the home, in the deaf club, between friends. I think a
Okay.
BDA service is a much more formal, much more official thing. It's probably proofread. You've probably got people checking on the quality of that translation,
Yeah.
making sure that the content is correct. So there's more formal. That process is more formal. Still translation and interpretation. But I think that translation can be, you know, from written into sign language. You still go back to the source text to kind of check it. With informal stuff, you don't. It's kind of much more ephemeral. You know, it's much more fleeting.
Absolutely. I'm just checking my questions there. Earlier on, you mentioned, oh, now what was it there? You were talking about obviously the capital, the social capital that you bring to the community, and the social capital that you would have within the community, that social standing, it has its advantages.
Influence, you might say, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then people would appreciate you and say thank you. But was there different like classes of people that maybe were better at ghostwriters, or maybe people was working class? Did class system make any difference?
I think class in the deaf community hasn't been thoroughly researched yet. And I think way back in the day, you know, because we were deaf people were channeled into particular blue collar workers, and there were very few people working in white collar jobs like civil service clerks. Then deaf people would meet in the deaf club and they'd mingle, and it was they shared working class values. It was a working class community. Nowadays, I think we're in a different place, aren't we?
Well, it'd be interesting, particularly if you wrote the article now. I wonder it'd be nice to compare and contrast, see how things have changed.
Certainly in terms of class, it'd be different, I think. Yeah, yeah.
We've got, I think it's a comment coming in from Helen Fox. Oh, Helen's just commenting and letting us know that it's exactly the same in Wales. The Welsh Government provided live interpreting, and the BDA in Wales provided a summary.
But as I say, the problem that we talked about, the UK Parliament in England was not giving out information in BSL, you know. So yeah, then people were looking to other sources for that information.
Erin's got another question. Erin. So Erin's question is, forgive me if this has already been discussed, as I missed the first part of the live. Erin's a very young person, but you talked about deaf young people. How would you bring the deaf young people into ghostwriting? I'm just really curious.
I think ghostwriting happens when one deaf person asks another person. You don't set up a ghostwriting office with a sign above the door. It's a much more informal kind of proposition.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about maybe people at home are maybe thinking, actually, I was or still am a ghostwriter because you've done that, you've had that
Maybe.
experience.
Mm.
And in the past, we didn't have the same sort of technology. And now, if you think people have more access, whether it be through interpreters, whether it's
Yeah.
school, college education, or video phones.
Do you sign something to your video phone and send it to a pal? Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Maybe Erin, you can take it upon yourself to do some some informal study
That'd
research
be
and pass
great.
our
Thanks, Eric.
information back to Robert. So could I ask then about the difference between proofreading then and ghostwriting? Are they different?
Well, it could be part of the service, part of what someone did. Somebody might write something and pass it to the
Ah,
ghostwriter and say, "Can you just check that for me?" So yeah, that happened. That happened.
okay. Just checking my questions. Some deaf people, as you'll know, have maybe had to go to medical appointments
Yeah.
or, and it's great now we can get an interpreter. In the past, we couldn't. But,
Mm.
sometimes people would ask another deaf person to come with them. Is
Well,
that
it's
ghostwriting?
not ghostwriting, but often it would be the same person. The ghostwriter person would be the person who was invited along because they could communicate with the hearing
Ah,
authorities through gesture or whatever. And then they would kind of language broker between the two of them. And very often there was a sense of safety, two deaf people against one hearing person. So it was the safety and support, safety in numbers. Um, and a kind of
yep.
advocacy, that your deaf pal would remind you, and they'd be a witness to how many kind of tablets you were supposed to take in a day, and help you with those
Oh,
details.
I'm having flashbacks about writing down tablets. How many times you take during the day. The one thing I'm thinking about it is there was no mention of confidentiality. It didn't even have to be mentioned. Everybody just knew. It was sort of written in your kind of your being. I mean, what was
Yeah.
is that right? Was it automatic?
I didn't ask about that in the interviews, about whether
Mm.
people spoke to other deaf people about what they'd done, but I don't think it never came up. It
Mhm.
never came up. Nobody had kind of blethered to anybody else about what they'd done. There was no instance when deaf people reported that what they'd asked the ghostwriter to do had been passed on to hearing authorities or other deaf people.
And it's so interesting because confidentiality is the big hot topic in modern
Yeah,
day Britain, and
and
then
there's
we
a
didn't
lot of
have those
pressure and
rules,
so yeah, yeah.
and they just did it. They knew about keeping things private. They knew what to do. They didn't have to be told. As now we've got so many rules.
It was a responsibility, wasn't it? A social
Yeah, well, the
responsibility
briefcase,
that was
that's why you
part
needed
of
the
trust.
briefcase. I'll
Yeah.
never forget, honestly, his briefcase, because he had these number locks on them.
Bless
And as
him.
a child, I would try and break into it, and he said it's confidential, and I knew I had to give up. And it became the mystery briefcase because you want to know what was inside it. But you'd mentioned sort of earlier on about advocacy happening, and I wonder, is advocacy maybe a bit of part of ghostwriting too?
Well, I can imagine that, if you got a letter and someone asked you to translate it and, uh, they would say, "Oh, you better go and get some advice on this."
Ah,
I mean, obviously, if a deaf person doesn't know that a service exists, then there might be signposted to a service, or there might be signposted. That's a kind of form of advocacy. I think that still happens with interpreters, but I think it certainly happened back in the day. Certainly happened with the hearing missioners who used to run the deaf clubs. Remember, they used to say, "Oh, you can't marry so and so. So and so won't be good for you." They used to really interfere in the lives of deaf people, and now people are
mhm.
afforded much more privacy, much more space. I know things aren't perfect, but I think we have a better idea of sort of what's appropriate and yeah.
Robert, before I close, and I can't believe I'm saying that, could I ask you if you've got, I mean, because honestly, we have got 5 minutes left. I cannot believe it's been nearly an hour. Have you got any last thing that maybe you would want to tell our audience about ghost writing, about how it's appreciated, that we recognise it from the past and we recognise in its form now, and that how, or do we just say it's changed and let it evolve itself?
I think it's not going to come back as it was. It's a very different world that we live in now. But I think it's very important that we remember how the community supported each other and how we do support each other, how we advocate for each other's rights, like the kind of work that
Mhm.
the BDA does, but also how we can support each other by giving each other information, it's very difficult because we don't have those physical spaces anymore, like the Deaf Club, where we could see something happening and
Mhm.
step over and provide support. But I think um, I think deaf people appreciate information, they appreciate advice, they appreciate being signpost to what's good, they appreciate sharing. That they don't tend to hold things back. They like to share information, and I think that's still a value.
It's so interesting you saying that because obviously deaf clubs have been closed, but I went recently to a deaf club that's just been back. And I'm absolutely sure there's people there, I saw it with my own eyes, natural ghostwriters. It's still happening because they hadn't seen each other for all that time. And it can be from the tiniest little, can you spell a word, to a big mammoth, maybe legal task. And I'm just saying, thinking to our audience out there, you're already being ghostwriters without thinking about it. You're giving that part of
Absolutely.
yourself back to the deaf community. How many people, who knows? And you're doing it every day without thinking, and it's just happening.
Yeah, it's a deaf community value, isn't it? We support each
Yeah,
other. We
and it's
share
so
our
important.
skills and our knowledge. Yeah.
Oh, what a lovely way to end. Is there anything else you want to add, Robert, before I formally close our hour?
I don't think so. Just to say
Oh,
thank
oh,
you.
hang on, hang on. We've got another question
Oh,
come in. It's
okay.
from Magella, Northern Ireland. So, in the old days, you mentioned many deaf people had the confidence to ask their deaf peers to do the writing. This century, however, deaf people may be embarrassed to ask for support. They may prefer to ask deaf or hearing translators because they can guarantee confidentiality.
Mm, mm.
What do you think, Robert?
Well, yeah, yeah. There are professional rules now, aren't there? And we have access to work. And, if you're going to a medical appointment with the doctor, there are rules about confidentiality and respect that govern those interactions. So,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. It's a very different world, isn't it? It's just a different world. Um, but, you used to have someone, you can have someone sitting there and supporting you now, which when we have so many rights that we didn't used to have, which is great.
Do
But
you
yeah,
remember all the paperwork? Oh.
But the rules,
All
the
the
rules.
rules.
We have the rules.
Well, everyone, and you, Robert, thank you so much for joining us for this
Thank you
last
for
hour.
asking me.
It's been amazing, and when we look around Scotland, I am absolutely sure we've got many ghostwriters, and I want to say we appreciate everything you've done and you continue to do.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to join you. It's been such a pleasure. It's still so nice, isn't it, to sit in a room and chat
Oh,
about death
yeah.
feelings and
Well, please come on, part 2. We need a part 2. Start tomorrow.
definitely. You're on. You're on. I'll report back.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
so much. Bye.